What's up, Ian? How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back. Been looking forward to it.
Yeah, man, you are my first repeat guest. So I'm excited too because, I get to kind of skip the intro and the formalities and we can just have a conversation. So I'm excited for this one.
All right, let's hop into it.
Yeah. So I read your Mexico out or overview of the airports this morning with the industry analysis, and it was really good, man. It was really detailed. So I figured that's a good place to start since we were planning to talk about Mexico. So tell me a little more about, Mexican airports and your view on Mexico.
All right, so those are the stocks I've held the longest in Latin America. I've owned them since 2016. So been a lot of volatility along the way. We had the Trump election scare. We had COVID, where they dropped 70% in 2 weeks. Last year, there's another scare where there were headlines that the government was going to nationalize the contracts, which was kind of a misreading of things. Things calmed down and they recovered, but they've sold off again this summer. Part of that's due to the election results in Mexico. Part of that is due to currency dropping, kind of the dollar and the yen have gone up and emerging market currencies have gone down. Yeah, and then you've got all the planes that are grounded from the Pratt and Whitney engine problems. And that's taken about 15% of capacity out of the market. So obviously fewer planes flying to airports means the traffic numbers are down year over year. People aren't used to that. Usually these grow double digit top line every year. And so I think that's disappointed investors. Obviously it's not any issue with the market for air travel in Latin America, which is continuing to grow quickly, but simply a supply problem. And once that clears up, I expect the traffic numbers will look a lot better and we'll get back to healthier multiples. Typically, they trade at 12 to 15 times PBD, but they're under 8 times now. And so I think you're getting both a good starting price and kind of on slightly depressed earnings and EBITDA at the moment. So I really like the setup for the Mexican airports here. I think they will be strong performers over the next 12 months.
So what do you make of the peso? Because you posted a great chart going back to 2016, I think, and it's pretty stable, it looked like. And I know a lot of the expats are kind of in panic 'cause there's been some recent volatility, but what should investors think about when it comes to the peso?
Yeah. So for people that haven't seen the chart, just kind of the overview would be the peso was around 18 for a few years. Then Trump won, it went up to 21. Higher number means weaker peso, stronger US dollar. Then it went back to kind of 18 after people saw nothing changed. Under the Trump administration, there's the new free trade deal. During COVID, it panic spiked up to 25 because people didn't know what would happen with Mexico. As it turned out, Mexico was a beneficiary of COVID. Its travel sector recovered very quickly because they didn't put COVID-19 restrictions on tourism. So it gained market share in tourism. And then obviously manufacturing has arrived in great numbers in Mexico as people are kind of reorganizing their supply chains to be closer to home. So Mexico is doing very well. The peso rallied all the way to 16 to the dollar, which was the strongest it had been in a decade. Just over the past couple of months, it sold off from 16 back to 20, which is kind of the center of its longer term range. But anytime a currency drops 20% in a few months, that's going to scare some people. My opinion, that's mostly just tied to the carry trade. Obviously, Japan, the Japanese yen has been making wild moves recently. Japan raised interest rates at last. A lot of people had been betting against the yen and then buying higher yielding assets, including you could buy Mexican peso bonds or CDs. They're paying like 11%. So you borrow yen at 0% interest, buy Mexican peso bonds at 11%, making very good money. That trade had a hiccup this year with now the yen going up, people covering some short positions, but I think that's pretty irrelevant to the longer term value in the Mexican economy. They have a very low inflation rate, one of the lowest in emerging markets historically, averaged just 1% over the US inflation rate over the past decade. A strong central bank that's independent that has fought inflation very well, and particularly with all the new foreign money flowing in to build factories, I think there will be demand for the peso, and so I'm not worried about the value there. I think the currency should be stable going forward.
Yeah. The carry trade's crazy. I had a blind squirrel macro on at the beginning of the year, 6 months ago, and he posted a chart showing that the yen carry trade to the Mexican peso, and if you had rolled it over since like 2021, you outperformed everything, and it was an
It
incredible
was
trade.
at the peak, it was 35% IRR from the COVID lows through the high this summer.
I don't know how many people are actually in the yen peso carry trade, but yeah, I mean, it was pretty crazy to see the chart. So, when you look at equities in Mexico or a country you don't live in, do you think about currency risk? Because it's one of the questions I get all the time. And I never really know how to respond because it kind of depends on what country the person lives in, like what the pair is. And then, it's hard enough to have an outlook on a single currency, but it's hard to give a good answer to people other than I don't know or don't worry about it. So what do you tell people when they ask you about currency?
Yeah, like you said, the country really matters. If it's a country that chronically devalues its currency, like Turkey or Argentina or Zimbabwe for the classic example, then obviously you need to worry about it because those are not countries that have proven that they have like an institutional framework that will lead to monetary stability. And so I think you have to think about how am I going to lose money when the next devaluation inevitably occurs in that sort of country. A country like Colombia, where I live now, I would expect the Colombian peso rather, to gradually drop over time, but not like plunge because
Yeah.
Colombia has an independent central bank, but it's running a fairly sizable deficit. The economy is much overly tied to oil. And so I would make an argument for a case like Colombia, you'd expect maybe the currency will lose 2 or 3% of its purchasing power compared to the dollar every year. Kind of factor that into your longer term model. A country like Mexico, where you have a ton of capital flowing in and you have a great central bank, I think there you can assume the currency is going to be pretty stable. Like the Mexican peso, if you had just bought bonds Mexico and kept rolling them over, you've outperformed like Japanese yen and British pounds over 20 years.
Interesting.
So yeah, it totally depends on the country. But like Argentina, for example, you can't leave cash in Argentina. There you have to have an exit strategy.
Yeah. Well, it's always different too if you are willing, though. Argentina and Turkey in the extreme case, I agree. But with Brazil, where I live, I was going to tell them, like, I'm okay the dollar exchange rate falls because I don't need to take the money out. So I guess if you're willing to
Yeah.
reinvest in the country, then it's okay. But yeah. So what else about Mexico? What'd you think of the election? Because you're positive on it. It's getting some crazy headlines. I think it surprised some people that, they have control of the Congress as well. So what do you make of it?
Yeah, well, I'm positive to the extent that I view her as being a continuation of the outgoing president. Let me back up. So AMLO was president of Mexico for 6 years. He was elected under a pretty left-wing populist agenda. Mexican stocks sold off, I believe, about 20% when he won. And then once he took office, he was friends with Trump. He negotiated a new free trade deal. Like nothing changed economically in terms of Mexico's policies with the world. And so Mexican stocks recovered. Mexican equities are up. Before the recent correction, I believe they're up 150% since mid-2020. Clearly, he was not too big of a impediment to pro-business policies happening in Mexico. He was term limited. Mexico doesn't allow re-election of presidents. And so he picked his successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, who won the election handily, which made sense. He had a 70% approval rating. So, of course, whoever he picked was going to win. People liked him because the economy grew, crime went down, like good things happened in Mexico. So, of course, people voted for his successor. No big surprise. She's campaigned slightly more to the center of him, but mostly continuing his policies. I'd say the positive is she was educated in the US. She speaks good English. She has more understanding of kind of technocratic, like trying to measure efficiency of stuff. She was mayor of Mexico City and the city improved under her watch. I don't think she'll waste money on huge projects. Like he built a huge railroad in the jungle that no one's using. He built airports, government run airports that nobody wanted, a government run airline. He was nationalizing like railroad stuff, like all this like infrastructure stuff that was like what Latin American leaders did 50 years ago, but is not relevant or useful in 2024. And I think she'll have a more reasonable approach, but obviously she's still going to be a left winger. But if you were content investing in Mexico under AMLO, I don't see why her election changes anything really. Yeah, and the congressional question, they fell just short of a supermajority, which in Mexico, if you have a supermajority, you can do whatever you want. But they got a couple of congressmen to cross the aisle. And so effectively they have control to do whatever they want in Congress for the time being. Clearly people are most worried about reforming the Constitution, which sounds bad, but keep in mind Mexico's Constitution has been reformed more than 700 times since it was enacted in the 1910s. So this is not a sacred document by any means. It gets reformed every time the power changes. There's certain reforms that I think are bad, like the having people vote for judges rather than judges being appointed is probably bad. Like I don't think the average voter is that informed. So I don't love that move. But most of the stuff that they're talking about is like stuff like banning GMO crops, which whatever. Like if you want to do that, great. I can see why people that are in the agriculture sector would be offended by that, but if you're the investor in an average Mexican company, like, do you care about like the government wanting to own lithium mines or banning GMO crops or whatever? Like, it's very bad if you're in those individual sectors, but it's not
Yeah.
sort of stuff that like I own airports, I own retail staff, a water company. These aren't things that are probably going to affect my day-to-day returns in Mexico.
Yeah, yeah. Mining's the one I follow most closely, and the mining community is pretty up in arms. But I also don't know how much, well, it can always get worse, but I don't know how much worse it can get. They're already talking about bans on open pit mining. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested to see, but it's definitely not bullish Mexico. But what about then like value added companies on top of agriculture? Like if you don't want to be in the actual farm business, what do you think about, maybe like Jose Cuervo or Gruma, Bimboa, the companies that have a brand on top of an agriculture business or product?
Yeah, I'm upbeat on consumer products companies there. I believe we're seeing the Mexican middle class emerge with all these manufacturing jobs. People are either going from being unemployed or kind of working at below minimum wage to go into all these new manufacturing jobs that pay $4 or $5 an hour, which is maybe 5 times what they're making before. And so you have all these households that are suddenly above like the threshold of just what you need to survive. So now they can travel for the first time. They can buy, like you said, branded food products rather than cooking at home. They can buy nice alcohol rather than whatever the cheapest beer is. So there's a lot of opportunity for trade up. I think that'll only continue to grow. And you have companies like Tesla putting huge factories in northern Mexico and paying very high wages relative to what Mexico has offered in the past. I think anything that has kind of that middle class angle should do well.
Then I guess the only other commodity I'll ask you about, because I guess it's kind of a unique case, is oil in Mexico, right? What do you think of Pemex, the state-owned oil company?
Um,
You think you think it's a big change for investors? Well, there are no investors, right? It's state-owned, but do you expect big changes at the oil company, or you think she leaves it be?
One of AMLO's big initiatives was building a refinery that costs, I forget what it was, $11 billion or $17 billion or some obscene amount of money, and it's not expected to ever be profitable. And that was kind of the risk in AMLO's approach, was he wanted to invest tons of money in these white elephant projects that didn't make any sense. I'm hopeful that she will cut back spending on these sorts of things that make for good photo ops but aren't useful. I wouldn't expect any privatization of energy under her. I don't think that's. And even the last conservative government in Mexico really struggled. They were trying to privatize, but there was more institutional opposition to that than I think people had expected. So I don't see why that would be a priority for her administration.
Interesting. So then, are there any other major headlines that caught your attention in Mexico before we jump to another country? Related to the election,
Um,
economy, nearshoring. What should investors keep their eye on?
I think the next big thing will just be seeing what happens with the US. Yeah, the majority of Mexico's hard currency comes from selling products to the US and Canada. So it's essentially the manufacturing arm of North America Inc. Like Trump's talked about a 20% tariff on all imports, which from my understanding would be illegal under at least as it relates to Mexico, because Mexico has the free trade deal with the US. But that could be a significant hindrance if you tried to put a 20% tariff on everything coming to the US. On the Democrat side, I don't know what Harris's view will be towards China, but I mean, if you long Mexico, your overarching hope is that Mexico continues to take market share from China on imports. And so I'd be watching very closely to see kind of how Harris would posture in terms of like, are we going to keep the EV bans from China? Are we going to keep the technology? What's the word? But basically, like you can't hire. Yeah, if you're American, you can't work for Chinese tech companies, and there's all the embargoes around all the sensitive technology stuff. Now, you've seen just over the past year the first investments in the Mexican semiconductor industry, which in the past that was viewed that Mexico wasn't skilled enough uh, to
Mhm.
produce semiconductors, but people are saying, well, we need to diversify our supply chains. And like as TSM, Taiwan Semiconductor saw, it's expensive to try to build stuff like in Arizona. They've had issues with that plant. And so people are saying, maybe we can do this in Mexico and we need to give it a shot. A lot will come down to what happens with the next administration, whether they keep promoting technology in North America rather than China or Vietnam.
Yeah, I think that's like a classic Latin American misconception, right? Like Mexico makes helicopters and jet engines, and why couldn't they produce chips and whatnot? But for whatever reason, South America, Latin America is perceived as being having less competent labor. But yeah, people fly in the planes and don't worry that the Mexicans made the engine. So I don't think they'll worry if they make the computers either.
In the past, there was a shortage of enough skilled engineers that spoke Spanish, or at least were educated in Mexican or Colombian or whatnot universities. But the education system has continued to improve. So I'm hopeful that this crisis, particularly what we had with the pandemic, will encourage entrepreneurs to keep trying to take advantage of new opportunities in the region.
So one more airport and travel question before we move on, because I've been looking for a beach vacation, and for whatever reason, Cancun is continually the cheapest flight to like a nice beach place I might go. And you mentioned in your write up that we might be at peak Cancun, that you don't think the airport has much more capacity. So have we reached peak Cancun, or what do you think?
I've been surprised at how far Cancun's grown, so I could continue to be surprised and it grow more. But the airport's already at 34 million passengers a year, which makes it one of the 40 busiest airports in the world, which is pretty incredible, given that there's no actual like city or economy in Cancun. It's all tourism. The government created Cancun out of nothing. It was jungle. There were 100 people living there in 1970 when the government decided we're going to build Mexican Disney World here. It's been tremendous, but I just don't see how it continues to grow. Prices have gone up. Now crime is starting to go up because the criminals see there's all these rich people that don't speak Spanish here that we can take advantage of. This happened once before in Mexico where Acapulco was their premier tourist destination, and then it got too big for its own good, and then it kind of collapsed, and now no one goes to Acapulco anymore. I'm not saying Cancun's going to collapse or anything, but it just I don't know, I think people need to be reasonable in their expectations. I don't think it continues growing to the sky indefinitely.
So is there another beach then that's coming up? Because I didn't realize that Tulum had an airport because it screens as like much more expensive, and that AMLO built it. So it's a state. So what's the story behind his airport? I learned that in your write-up. So what's that story?
Just that he felt that they needed to promote more tourism across the whole Yucatan Peninsula, not just Cancun. And so he decided to build an airport there. Well, the government had wanted to build an airport there for past administrations, and they were going to bid it out to actually Pacifico and Sureste had bid on the airport before, like a decade ago. But then because this guy doesn't like the private operators, he decided to have the military build it, which is unfortunate. But
why is it
whatever.
not? It seems to have not eaten any of Cancun's traffic, right? Because it's a competitor airport, or no? Am I confusing geography?
I have, but it's like 120 kilometers, I think. It's like 2 hours down the shore. So it's mostly people that want to go to Tulum or places closer to Tulum or the border with Belize. But it will take some, I think I've modeled 8 to 10% traffic loss at Cancun, assuming international airlines want to fly to Tulum.
Okay.
But what other beach cities? I think just opened last December, I believe.
Okay, interesting. So it hasn't the trend hasn't really started yet. If they're going to start eating into Cancun, I guess.
Yeah, but for the other beach cities, Puerto Vallarta more for retirees, more for expats, older people with money, and then Cabo more for the spring break, wanting to Instagram, put stuff on social media crowd. That would be my guess for the two that will take traffic from Cancun.
Interesting. All right, so I'm going to bridge now to Argentina because I got a airport type question, but I'm curious about the open sky policies, right? So one of the first things Milei did when he came in was to implement open sky policies, right? So now international airlines can come in. So how's that impacted the airlines and the industry in general, the airports? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, he's obviously wants to foster a real domestic airline industry. Previously, it's just been the state-run Argentinian airline, which was horribly inefficient, high fares, bad service, tons of lost luggage. So he's either attempting to privatize or sell off or whatever, stop subsidizing the state-run airline. We've seen a couple of discount airlines within Argentina spring up, and then, like you said, foreign airlines will have the opportunity to compete in the market as well. I don't think the domestic market's ever going to get that huge just because there's no other big city besides Buenos Aires. Like the next biggest city is Rosario, I think, which is like 1.2 million.
Yeah. But and Mendoza's about the same too, I think.
Yeah, but anyway, there's no other. It's not like Mexico where you have Guadalajara, which is 6 million people, and so that's a huge route, like Guadalajara to Mexico City. I don't think you'll have a huge domestic market in Argentina, but hopefully more foreign carriers will fly to Buenos Aires. Yeah, we'll see. Some of the JetSmart in Chile is doing really well. They're expanding all over the continent, so that would be logical for a Chilean airline to expand its presence in Argentina.
Yeah, it'd be cool if there were more. It'd be cool to see more connections too. Like I had friends from Sao Paulo that went to Barlioche, and they were able to get a direct flight. And I know I went to Mendoza once, but there was only 1 or 2 flights a week out of Sao Paulo, and Sao Paulo is huge. I feel like there's more tourist demand than there were flights, at least 4 or 5 years ago. So it'd be cool if they start to get some of the more the smaller cities connected more internationally, like Salta. I don't even think you can get a direct flight from Brazil. I could be wrong. I don't know. I just play around. But
uh, one other point I'd make on that is that Milei was the chief economist for the Corporation America, the airport operator, prior to becoming president. And so he knows the sector very well. And I assume he has some personal motivation to make it better just from having worked at the airport company prior. So I think that's a cool thing for the
yeah, yeah.
story.
He seems like someone that was probably pretty frustrated dealing with a nationalized company, right? And I think he wants a little bit of revenge, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. When you see him crusading against the state agencies, I just imagine him in the offices of this airport company just complaining like the foreign air carriers can't fly here due to all the regulations. That being
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the moment that inspired him.
Yeah. So what's your view overall on his first, 9 months as president? You think it's been positive, neutral, you disappointed? What do you think?
Oh, I'd say better than average. Probably better than expected. It's not been perfect. Obviously, the economy is in a slump now, which when you fire half your government employees, you're going to cause an economic slowdown just because all that spending power disappears. Obviously, having printing money to pay your government employees is not a sustainable way of doing business in the long term. Someone had to put a stop to it.
Right.
And so, yeah, he's balanced the budget, which was the first time since the 1980s that they've had a consistently balanced budget. The peso stopped devaluing. The inflation rates come under control. So he's planted the seeds for what could be a more stable economy. Will he have enough time with a good approval rating to
Hmm.
maintain those policies and see it through? I don't know. I'd say the last time we saw anything similar to this was kind of Poland, Czech Republic, all those guys when they exited the Soviet Union and just embraced what was called shock capitalism. You had like 2 years of very bad economy in Eastern Europe. And then several of those countries stuck to the capitalist medicine and have come out very strong. Poland's the fastest growing economy in Europe now. It's done tremendously well. I believe Poland just passed Spain in terms of wealth, which was
Really?
unimaginable. Yeah, in 1990 when they were leaving the Soviet Union.
Right?
So yeah, I'd say that's a model.
Spain's definitely the opposite of a capitalist model at this point, right? They're closer to what Argentina was than what Poland is, I guess.
Definitely heading that way.
So do you think
I'd say Milei's made the right moves so far, but it's a very difficult electorate. They get upset very easily, and he'll need to get things. He'll need to get more jobs going and kind of help people's pocketbook before people vote again.
do you think
I'd
it's
say
bottomed
he's
though?
doing what.
You think the pain is in, they've taken the medicine, or do you think it could still get worse before it gets better?
My concern now is just on commodity prices. And so much of Argentina is tied to exporting crops and cattle and metals and all. So obviously the continued downturn in China is not helpful for Argentina's economic outlook.
Yeah, soy's been brutal
So yeah,
too.
that's my concern is just if grain prices, cattle doesn't turn up, that could be a problem.
Then what about the equities? I think I remember you had the index going into the election, right? So you still positive on the Argentine stock market?
Yeah, I'd be a little more selective now. A lot of stuff's run up quite a bit. Like the banks
Yeah.
in particular, I think have tripled. And also keep in mind the index, the largest holding is Mercado Libre, which is not really an Argentine company. Like it has more sales in Brazil and Mexico than in Argentina. They have a couple of IT outsourcers like Globant in there as well. And so you're getting some technology factor as well if you buy the Argentine ETF, which is be aware of that. I personally own a ton of the Argentine airport company, much smaller positions than anything else.
Yeah, I noticed that when things started to run up, like Decolar had run up, and their finances, the last time I looked, were pretty bad. I mean, they looked like they were in bad shape. And then I looked, and I forget whether they were up 2x or 3x. I haven't looked at the chart, but they were up, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, okay, everybody's buying just anything from Argentina on the election news. But I think you're right. It's probably more of a stock picker's market at this point.
I own I own a tiny bit of that. It's called Despegar, Argentina.
Oh, yeah.
Decolar.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. It's Decolar's the
No,
Brazilian
no
one.
problem. But yeah, I own a
Yeah.
tiny bit of it. It was like leveraged, and so it's like, well, if things go right, you can get a pretty big
Yeah.
move. But yeah,
They
it's
don't
one
make
that
they don't make
not
money.
too profitable. No.
So, what else about Argentina then? I mean, what's your outlook for the next 12 months in general? Are there any industries, if grains stay down, would you look at Argentine agriculture companies? Do you like other travel plays? What do you think?
I don't really have any other strong views. The airport company is my strong view in that market.
Yeah.
I think that one's still mispriced. The thing I really like about that is that the revenues on other international flights that arrive are paid in dollars. I get $57 per passenger that arrives in Buenos Aires. And so you don't have to worry about currency. You don't have to worry about inflation.
Hmm.
It's
Interesting.
wonderful dollar revenues. Yeah. They benefit from some of the same factors that we were discussing with the Mexican ones in terms of you have the short term capacity that's gotten taken out of the market. So you'll see really big traffic growth numbers next year once all the airplanes come back. It's trading at
Yeah.
like 7 times EBITDA, which is just a silly price. I mean, it kind of made it halfway made sense when Argentina was a failed state, but now that Argentina is not a failed state, makes
Right.
no sense to the stocks at 7 times. It was at 7 times during the bottom of the pandemic. Like since then, the stock's gone up 7 or 8 fold, but EBITDA is like double where it was prior to the pandemic. I don't know what I don't know why the stock's still so cheap.
Yeah, the other market I'm curious about because I've had a couple, people whose opinion I respect about Argentina that know the real estate market. They think the market's bottomed. So they think like, we don't see any, price per square meter go lower than it was in 2023. And I've had a few people too
Mm-hmm.
tell me like, oh, I looked at a place in Buenos Aires or Barlioche and I'm just waiting. And I'm inclined to think that maybe the people that think it's bottomed are right. And the people that have dreamed about buying a place in Buenos Aires or Argentina are just going to watch prices, gradually climb up and they're not going to get the dip they're looking for.
That could be. Yeah, I don't know what the prices were in 2023. I didn't visit last year. I lived there 6 months in 2015. At that time, I thought real estate was really expensive, like compared to the rents that were being offered. But I have no idea what the prices were last year.
It's like a nice neighborhood in Buenos Aires is like 2,000 to 2,500 per square meter, except for Puerto Madero, which is like absurdly expensive for what it is. For some reason, that's some of the most expensive real estate in South America if you want to live in Puerto Madero. Yeah, Bowtied Mara, anonymous account. He covers it really well because he's an expat that's been there for like 20 years and, knows the real estate market. And he posted a chart like last week, I think, with the prices by neighborhood. So yeah, I'll be interested to see. I'm curious though too if some of the monetary premium comes out as the economy normalizes. So maybe if you were to make the case that it could go lower, all the people that have just been buying real estate to protect from the peso because they can't get the money out, if those people actually start to invest into the real economy, then maybe some of that monetary premium comes out of real estate. But it doesn't seem that unreasonable relative to other cities like Sao Paulo or Santiago. In downtown Sao Paulo, it's roughly the same price as Buenos Aires is now for a comparable neighborhood.
And do you have a sense of the cap rates? Like, are you getting more or less rental yield?
I don't know. When I asked Bowtie Mara, he told me that Airbnb was getting crushed, but Milei also started changing around some of the rental rules and the bureaucracy around rents. So I think it's the same thing we talked about generally, where like you're getting the initial adjustment where there might be some pain or some dislocations in the market until the changes that he implemented take effect. But I'm not sure because
Right.
I've only ever done Airbnb. So, for me, the prices stay pretty comparable across big cities if you go Airbnb. But if you were doing a long-term rental, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess my one concern there would be if Malay's reforms fail and then you bring back the Kirchners or some other socialist in 3 years
Yeah.
from now, then you're not going to have any exit liquidity for your properties.
No, you're gonna have yeah, right, and you're just gonna have a place in Buenos Aires that's half empty. But
Yeah, that's a good thing about equity markets. Market's always open every week if you need to sell or have a change of mind.
yeah, I'm surprised. I haven't heard of many funds putting together like specific Argentina strategies. I know Vinici Partners, which is a Brazilian firm, but they're listed in the U.S. They were pitching a distressed fund pretty quickly after Milei won, but I've been surprised that I haven't heard more headlines about major international investors coming in yet. Maybe they're taking the same approach to wait and see, worried about the same thing. Maybe that if he loses the next election, then it's all going to get undone anyway. I don't know.
Yeah, I think if he does well in the midterms, which will be next year, and we start becoming optimistic that he can get reelected, I think a lot more long-term capital will commit. I think there's a lot of people that are still in just for the swing trade, like ride it for the first year or two of his reforms. So that's kind of what played out. 2015, conservatives won in Argentina. The stocks went up until 2017. They underperformed in the midterms, and then everything started selling off. They devalued again in 2018, and then new lows by COVID. So I think people are worried that you'll just have kind of that 1 year honeymoon and then things start to fade.
Yeah. It's been decades of bad news, right? And bad place to invest. So I'm not surprised people are waiting more than the 9 months, especially because there's always the
Yeah,
occasional headline too, like what was the vulture fund, Paul Singer, I think that like they stole Argentina's boats back in the
that's
day.
right.
Yeah. So like there's no shortage of those news articles people remember about investing in Argentina. So I'm not surprised they're taking a more wait and see approach. Me too. I mean, I haven't invested anything in Argentina. I've looked at the stocks, but We'll see. So, I got to ask you about Colombia then. So, you live there. I'm always curious about it. It's one of the countries I spend the most time in my time in South America. So, what's going on in Colombia?
Yeah, so we're 2 years into our left wing president's 4 year term. He was the first left winger elected in Colombia since we enacted our constitution in 1991. So there's a lot of panic that we were going to go full Chavez or full Castro upon electing a socialist. That has not happened. His coalition in Congress almost immediately collapsed. Now Congress votes down pretty much anything he proposes. The Supreme Court, even if he does manage to pass stuff, the Supreme Court invalidates most of it. And so there's been very little actual structural change affected by the president. His approval rating is down to 25%. There were huge strikes 2 weeks ago where the truckers parked their trucks on all the major highways in front of cities. So we had shortages of eggs and milk and onions and stuff, protesting his economic policies. And so I'd say we're kind of at the point where we're hitting peak frustration with the government, which is fine. It's been a ineffectual government. But at some point, you hit the point where you say, well, this guy's been a complete failure. He's a lame duck. Like, he can't get anything through Congress. The court rejects everything that he tries to do through executive order. And you start looking forward to the 2026 election when we will elect a conservative. I don't know which conservative, but obviously we're not going to re-elect somebody with a 25% approval rating who's been an economic fiasco here. Now he's trying to raise taxes because now that oil's gone down, the state oil company makes less money. So the credit rating agencies are threatening to downgrade Colombia. So he's trying to raise taxes, but good luck trying to raise taxes with a 25% approval rating and no support in Congress.
It's already a fairly high tax country, right?
Uh-huh. Because it's so bad at enforcement.
Yeah. That's a story across South America, right? I mean, there's the official tax and then there's what the government actually collects. But did he get, so I saw headlines about pension reform. Was he able to pass some type of pension reform?
That's like the one.
Did he do that by executive order?
Material thing.
Or he got it?
No, that one was fairly popular because historically pensions, pretty much you only get a pension if you work for the government or a very wealthy, like kind of multinational sort of company. I believe only 19% of Colombians have a pension, if I recall correctly. And so the proposal is to have a more U.S. Social Security style system where people pay into a government-run pension rather than like a company-run, right? Like you used to have in the US, where like your IBM or GE or whoever would have a private pension, and that's more switched to either 401ks or just relying on Social Security in the US. And so they've proposed more of a Social Security style program where the government will ensure that most Colombians have access to some sort of pension. And obviously this annoyed the rich people who enjoyed their defined benefit programs through wealthy companies, but I don't think as Colombia gets wealthier, it made sense for most people to not have a pension. Like almost everyone in my wife's family has no money coming in once they retire. You rely on your kids. If your kids get sick or they move, then then you're old and you have nothing and you go begging, go to the church, ask for money. Like I don't think that's a sustainable system. So I understand why there was support for some sort of Social Security style program. As for the effect, it hurts Aval, which is one of the publicly traded banks because they're the biggest pension manager in the country. They will lose some business up front. That said, the government conceded that they get to charge higher fees on the asset management business they do, kind of as a concession for giving up some of the assets they control to government programs. So I don't think it's as bad as the market thinks, but obviously we've seen Aval stock drop 20 or 30% year to date, whereas the other Colombian bank is up year to date. So clearly that's weighed on the market's opinion of those two businesses, relatively speaking.
Do you know if there's like allocation requirements for the pension now? Like, is that going to imply like a deepening for Colombia's investment market? Are these state pensions now, are they going to buy Colombian equities? Are they going to buy government debt? Or are they going to be investing in, globally diversified? You know how they're going to structure the portfolio?
That is a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure if those details have been released yet. That would be a good question. That's something I should have mentioned for Mexico. Mexico approved reforms that will cause their pension programs to invest a lot more in stocks, less in bonds over the next decade gradually. So that's a big tailwind I didn't mention for the Mexican market. But Colombia, I don't know those details yet.
Yeah, because a lot of times, like in Brazil, for example, they just use it. There's these things called Previdencia Privada, which is like you get the tax benefit of a pension plan, but it has to be like 55% in government treasuries. So if you look at any of these funds, it's just the management fee. It's the interest rate minus the management fee is all you get, and you get the tax benefit. But they give you the tax benefit in exchange for buying their debt. So I was curious if they did something like that, and it might just imply increased debts or a funding mechanism for the government.
Yeah, that would be my guess. Having not seen the details, I think there's only about 20 companies listed in Colombia that have any meaningful liquidity, so there
Yeah,
wouldn't really be much to allocate into.
yeah. Oh well,
Obviously,
hopefully.
whenever there's a bull market, hopefully we'll get some IPOs. But yeah, our equity market is dead.
I mean, are you seeing Colombian companies? Are there any of the Colombian companies like do they go list abroad now, or does Colombia just not produce that many companies that go public in general?
Yeah, we had Technoglass, which was kind of our biggest success story. That listed in the US via SPAC and has gone up 5x since it listed. So would have
What do
been
you
nice
make of
if
that?
they listed here, but
What did you make of that? I covered them, and then the guy, what was I forget the short seller guy. I don't remember if it's the one that.
Hindenburg.
What did you make of their short thesis that it was all like money laundering? And is there anything to that?
Yeah, so I read the full report. I'd owned Technoglass before. Didn't have a position when the report came out, but I bought some after I read the report. The allegations were largely correct from what I could tell, but it was mostly like ancient history, like stuff they did in
Mm,
like what management did in the 1980s, 1990s. There's kind of this general agreement or understanding in Colombia that anything that happened during the Civil War is kind of in the past, and now kind of I mean we have people that were terrorists in the 1990s who are now in Congress. Like there's been complete forgiveness and so sure they were involved in things that did bad things in the 1980s. Like fine, that's true, but what point does that have to Technoglass's operations in 2023? Also, there was stuff about undisclosed related party stuff, like with their distribution in Florida. But I just say that's how all businesses operate in Colombia. They sell stuff through their uncles and nephews and all. Should the disclosure have been better at the SEC? Sure. And they improved their disclosure after the Hindenburg report. But there was nothing, it's like 40-page report, there was nothing in there that said the products don't work or the sales were inflated, or there's nothing that was like actually the business isn't what they say it is. Just like the team did bad stuff in the past and the management team is using their friends and family to sell product, which
oh yeah,
fine.
like welcome
Yeah.
to Latin America. But
But I think they also said the days of sales outstanding, like inventories were really high compared to US companies. But once again, that's how all our businesses operate. That's not really a short thesis. Like in a country where credit costs like 25% to get a line of credit from a bank, of course, people are going to slow pay their accounts payables. So that's not really a short thesis either.
right, yeah, makes sense. So you mentioned, I think the last time we spoke, that you were pretty positive on Colombian banks, or maybe one bank in particular. And then we talked about the pension reform. So are you still, positive on Colombian banks, or does the pension reform change your opinion?
The pension reform hurts Laval because they have a big business tied to asset management. It does not hurt Bancolombia to nearly the same extent. I'm still upbeat on both. Bancolombia has outperformed Latin America this year. I mean, low bar, but I think they still do well. There's only three banks that have close to 70% market share, and the government kind of protects them from competition. And so, big market to address. Bank Colombia is actually generating record earnings now. Earnings are twice what they were a decade ago, and the stock's half of what it was a decade ago.
Interesting.
Probably interesting valuation there. What's really interesting is them, they just pay half their earnings out as dividends, which has resulted in a 13% dividend yield just because the stock's so depressed. But,
It still yields 13%. Like is that dollar or is that peso terms?
I mean, it should be the same
I mean,
either
is it, I meant to say, is like it listed in Colombia exclusively, or can you get it on
No,
a
no,
foreign brokerage?
it's quoted in New York. Yeah.
It's on New York. Okay, cool. So how many Colombians, you said there's 20 stocks in general. How many are listed in the US? Like,
There's Ban Colombia, Ecopetrol, the oil
yeah.
company. What else? Technoglass, and then a tiny company, ProCaps, that makes vitamins and stuff. That's pretty
Okay.
much it.
Okay. So what else about Colombia then? Like how's life in general living in Colombia? Is quality of life still good, improving? People seem happy. How are things on the ground?
Yeah, the economy has definitely cooled off over the past year. Half of our hard money, like our dollars and whatever, comes from exporting oil. So we're not loving the return of $60 oil. Great. But no, life's pretty good. You see a lot of stuff on Twitter about like how dangerous Medellin or Bogota or whatever is, but it's not really like the life that you experience as a normal Colombian. My neighborhood, my city's quiet.
Yeah, most of the bad
But
headlines I see about Medellin is foreigners doing things they shouldn't be doing in any city anyway, and they get into trouble. But I spent, I don't know, maybe almost 6 months in Bogota in my life, and I never felt unsafe. I mean, granted, I stay by, Park 93 and maybe go down to 70th and take a tourist trip down to the Independence Square, whatever it's called, but I never felt unsafe in Bogota. It's an okay city.
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, so I think some of the stuff we see on Twitter is kind of weird. But that said, yeah, clearly the economy slowed down. People are frustrated. There's more protests, more graffiti and stuff against the government. But whatever, that's fine.
Is it the same like political divisiveness? Like, are people separated, or is everyone kind of in agreement that the current government is not doing very well at 25% approval rating?
I'd say it's pretty divided at the time of the last election, and that result was like 50 to 47, if I remember right. So it was almost equally divided. But even now, like most of his supporters have just stopped engaging in politics, and his opponents are more upset than ever. But it's not as divisive as like in the U.S. Like several people in my wife's family voted for the current president, and we didn't like exclude them from family functions or anything. It's not like the U.S. where people
Yeah,
are
yeah.
psycho about politics right now.
It's religion in the US. It's not politics anymore. It's crazy. In Brazil, it's similar too, I think, but it's equally unpopular like Colombia. Like the current government is not popular at all. So I think there's kind of some agreement about that, at least. What else, man? What do you think? I mean, are there any markets you think the US election is going to have a huge impact on, excluding Mexico, what we talked about, obviously, with the potential tariff if Trump wins, but anywhere else where you think there's a distinct impact based on the US election?
For Latin America, probably not. I think Mexico's clearly the most impacted. I'm really hoping China gets a pulse again at some point. Like everyone except Mexico is relying on exporting commodities, and so it's just a real bummer.
Yeah.
Demand's never been down this far this long from China. Like I want to be bullish on Chile. I love the institutions. I don't think Forex's nearly as bad as people think. But like, how can you get excited about Chile when like lithium prices are through the floorboards?
Copper too, and especially if Argentina gets their act together with mining, where there might actually be considerable competition.
Competition, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm with you. Chile's one I don't claim to understand that well. Even when I traveled there, it never really opened up to me. I always felt like a foreigner for sure. Whereas Brazil, even Colombia, Argentina, I felt like I at least understood some things. But Chile, I felt lost.
I was just in Peru for quite a while this summer. It's pretty run down. Like I was surprised, disappointed to see how it seems like they haven't really bounced back from COVID very well. A lot of
Yeah.
stuff was in worse shape than when I was there in the 2010s. So yeah, another market that's really struggling with the lower commodity prices.
Yeah, they had a lot of problems. Some of the mining stocks I follow, 2022 or 2023, and they were significantly blockading mines and significant production disruptions, and that's their cash cow. I mean, they did a good job of attracting mining investment for a decade or two, and if that goes, I don't know what else they do other than tourism.
Yeah, you get the sense that Lima is holding the country together by the strings, and without it, you're a slightly wealthier version of Bolivia. They can't
God
keep the.
forbid. Was it nice travel wise? I mean, did you worry about safety or the infrastructure just kind of sucked?
No, I never worry about safety in Peru. Like I'm in the mountain areas, it's like really laid back, like much nicer. Like people are great. I love the mountains in Peru. It's not very developed or whatever, but yeah, I love the mountains. And then Lima's really cheap now for people that are looking for
Okay.
budget travel.
I have heard, I've never been to Peru. It's probably top of my bucket list, top three probably. But I have heard stories from travelers that it's some of the craziest drivers in the
That
world.
is true.
And that like whatever you do, don't take a bus in Peru because the buses crash regularly. So I don't know. I've heard some terrifying stories.
I just got my driver's license in Colombia recently. We're buying a car and we're going to do a road trip from here on the coast down to the mountains, which is
Okay.
only like 600 kilometers, like 400 miles, but it's like 16 hours because the road is just atrocious.
Windy and
So, yeah,
okay.
two
What was it like
lanes through like mountain passes. So that's going to be an adventure.
Did you have to take the Colombia driver's test? Like, did you have to redo it, or did you have a U.S. or another country's driver's license and you just kind of translated it?
No, mine did. Mine from New York had expired like eons ago, and so they did not accept my expired license as proof of anything. And so I had to take like a 20-hour class, like hands-on instruction. I passed a written exam, 40 questions in Spanish, and then driver class with a person there. My wife did as well, and so we will now be able to do road trips in Colombia with the kids. But we'll see
Nice.
how that
Yeah,
goes.
it's essential. The kids too. It's airports. I bet are probably, great investments, but not a fun day if you got to go with the kids. But I'm dreading the driver's license things too. My fiance needs to renew hers in Brazil, and in Brazil it's the same thing. They make you take like driver's tests with official people, but it's known. Ask any Brazilian, they'll tell you it's one of the most corrupt things. So like basically you have to pay the guy in cash to get your driver's license no matter what you do. But they implemented like a biometric thing. So like
Uh,
you still have to show up for the classes. But apparently, like if you're just once you take the driving test, unless you put some cash in the guy's hand, there's no way you're passing and getting your driver's license. So you actually have to still sit there in the classes. You can't just pay him to skip it. You still have to waste 10 or 20 hours and then you just pay anyway. And it's not cheap. Apparently they expect like 200, $400, something like that, which in Brazil's
yeah, our program was about $250. It was biometric as well to ensure that people went, but no one asked us for favors.
yeah, I don't know. I've never done it, but she's not the first person that told me that, and it's been confirmed by a lot of people that yeah, like you're gonna show up with cash if you're getting your driver's license in Brazil. But
Yeah, I think Brazil is still a little more corrupt than some of the other countries in Latin
it,
America.
it's getting better, but there's still pockets of it for sure, and they do a very good job of hiding it too. So it's not typically that overt, but usually it's corrupt. Like you get the a lawyer, something goes wrong, get a lawyer, and then it's corrupt, and the lawyer kind of intermediates before you. But it's not usually some guy in a car saying, "Give me cash in my hand." I've never had that happen here.
That's good. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. We built this is my office in my house. We bought the lot and then designed and built the house, everything, and there was no issues with the bureaucracy whatsoever. Everything was as it should be. It only took the city like 3 weeks to approve our building permits and everything with the architect and the construction crew. Everything was like normal, like you'd expect in the US or whatever. I was
That's awesome.
surprised. I was expecting there to be red tape or needing to pay money to hurry things along or whatever.
And then after
Pleasantly
too,
surprised.
like property taxes are pretty reasonable. There's no crazy requirements once
It,
you actually own the home.
no, it's $400 a year, I think, for property tax.
Not bad at all.
Yeah, the city just assessed what the property is worth, and then you pay once a year at
Okay. Do
City
they
Hall.
assess it every year? They come back every year and give you a new price or a new value?
I don't know. We'll see. We moved in October last year,
Ah,
so
okay.
it will be 1 year very soon.
I'm curious. The next time we talk, I'm definitely gonna ask about that because I'm curious. I don't know how they do the valuations, right? Like how are they coming in and assessing your property value? Are they looking at your neighbor's recent transaction, or are they just adding inflation to what it was last year? I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. My wife's brother is a commercial lawyer, and so we just had him be in charge of like all the
Okay.
intermediary stuff with the city. But I'll ask if anything changes. I'll ask him like what's going on.
Cool.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
local help is always crucial, especially when it's in the family and you can trust them.
yeah. That's what got me when I was reading the Technoglass report. I was just thinking about like how I was building my house with like one of my wife's nephews being the foreman for our project and the architect being a friend of my wife's aunt. It was like, oh, this is how we're doing business. I'm
Yeah,
obviously not a corrupt person, but we're sourcing everything through my wife's family just because we know they're trustworthy. And so I can totally understand why Technoglass's management would do business the same way.
yeah, and it's not necessarily like you look at it from a public market investor perspective and you think, oh, that's kind of corrupt, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because there's more social pressure in South America cultures, I think. So like they're way more inclined to give you a fair price and do the job well if you have some kind of relationship or they know that you're in the same social network. They're not going to screw you over and they're going to do their best work.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
Cool, man. What else? Anything else going on that we should cover before we wrap up?
No, I think that pretty much. Oh, one more thing. I guess one of these is Argentine, but I really like the IT outsourcing companies. These are the companies that
Mm.
hire IT professionals to manage databases, cloud software, any sort of tech implementation that you need. There's huge businesses here in Colombia and Mexico and Argentina and Brazil for hiring people maybe in Colombia, I think they're paying about 25 to $30,000 a year for IT people that can
Yeah.
speak English that do a pretty good job. And then these guys are just stealing so much business from like all the all the guys who are earning $250,000 a year in the U.S. and bragging about having like
Dude,
5 different jobs.
dude, I got
Yeah, I think
some of the most vitriol I ever got on Twitter was I posted that like there's a lot of people getting laid off because there's a round of layoffs in Silicon Valley. It's like a lot of these middle managers getting laid off are past their career peak earnings. They just don't know it yet because I see the exact same
yeah,
thing. It's like you're not going to get $400,000 a year to do a basic developer job anymore when there's a Colombian that'll do it for 40, and he's not only excited about it, he's this is great. Like this is the best job I ever had. And they take like these companies, like my fiance works for one. She does sales for an American company and they take great care of her. And it's great for the company because she's cheaper and they don't have to pay a 401k and US healthcare costs and everything. But she still makes great money for the market she lives in. So it's a win-win for everybody. She's motivated to work. Like I can see that for sure taking off. And I feel like there's more cultural like connection between South American cultures and the US compared to like outsourcing it to the Philippines or like
yeah.
China. And then the time zones make a big difference too. I mean, like
Time
I don't
zone's
think
huge. Yep.
I can't imagine you're gonna have anybody in the Philippines that's long term happy working from 9 p.m. till 7 a.m. their whole life, right? You're nocturnal, it's not healthy. So like it works for short term projects, but if you're really trying to build a long term business, it makes a lot more sense to outsource it to Latin America, I think.
Yeah. So Globet is one that is headquartered in Argentina. It's publicly traded in New York, and then also EPAM and Dava. They're not LATAM companies, but they both they both employ a bunch of people in Latin America. I think those will be great growth businesses going forward. They're some
Yeah,
of my larger positions.
and then for anyone listening that's curious about the outsourcing stuff, if you're looking to hire somebody, there's a private one that's done really well too. Deal, Deel, that I know they do a lot of business here too. I think they're Argentinian or they might be in Uruguay, but yeah, they do all the bureaucracy basically. So they have a company structure set up. So when they hire someone in Brazil, for example, you get all the Brazilian benefits. So like you're a Brazilian employee, so you still get the guaranteed 30 days vacation. You still pay Brazilian taxes, but it's just an American company and they don't actually have to, go through the headache of an HR department in
Office.
Brazil, which is
Yeah.
a nightmare. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think I think that trend is gonna continue because it's so expensive to hire. Like some of what Americans make relative to the global averages for, not working that much. I understand why the best engineers and the best people in the world that live in the US make that kind of money, but for your mediocre salesperson or your mediocre developer, why not outsource it for 10% of the cost?
Yeah. And I know just from talking to people in Colombia, a lot of people are trying to encourage their kids, like, you need to learn English and then figure out how to make money with your computer. So it's going to,
It's
younger
it's
generation of Colombians that are coming up that are going to be hunting for those jobs.
I see it here. It's so funny because sometimes people overcomplicate things like what programming language should I learn and everything. And for your average Brazilian coming up, like just try and be fluent in English by the time you get out of college, and you're probably gonna boost yourself in the top 5% of jobs for people in your age and experience range. So I think that continues too, even with the AI and stuff, is personal connections and being able to speak to someone in the language help.
Yeah.
All right, man. This was fun as always. We're gonna do it again because you're still one of my favorite followers for finance and LATAM stuff. So before we wrap up, tell everyone where they can find you, the newsletter, where should I send them?
All right. Yep. So I'm very active on Twitter. IR Bezek, Bezek is my handle there. And then I write the Insider Corner, which is a weekly newsletter about anything I find interesting in investing, but primarily Latin American stocks. That's either on Substack or Seeking Alpha, either place. But yeah, Twitter, just quick question. I'm always around there.
All right. Thanks, Ian. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good.